Place I can read it. Hi, I'm Kristy Buzard. Very happy to be here. Thank you to the organizers for all your efforts and for including this paper on the program. I'm a faculty in the economics department here. I know some of you are probably surprised to see me. So I want to kind of explain to you what I'm doing and why I'm here to kind of frame what you're going to be hearing for the next 20 minutes. So I'm really an applied game theorist. Right? I'm not an area specialist. I know some case studies. I'm going to be talking about this kind of idea of unrecognized statehood, how this comes about, why it becomes persistent, but I'm not an expert. Right? This is why I have a great co-author, Ben Graham, who's at USC. The third co-author, Ben Horn, is deceased. He was the previous game theorist on this project. Was a very good friend who passed away in graduate school, and so I came in to take over and to try to kind of step into this vision that he had for bringing some really good formal modeling to questions of conflict, right? That he thought, and I believe now, that there is a space here that we can learn more by very carefully applying formal modeling to some of these questions. So I'm going to maybe hopefully convince you in the next 18 and a half minutes or so that that's the case. But I do think that you'll see, if you want to take a look at the paper, that we've tried to very carefully weave the formal modeling and the real details of these cases together. So you could tell me whether you think that's true or not. So we're going to take a very, I think, pretty standard definition of what an unrecognized state is. People who control and govern some territory and seek to be recognized as the ones who actually do that, right? In the cases that we look at in the paper, we're going to require that that's going on for a significant period of time. So there are obviously more cases than what we look at. We identify about 29 cases that were really ongoing. So for currently, Cyprus, where it currently is, we would say that there are 6 of these that have been going on for at least 20 years. And we have the Eastern Ukraine that is rapidly developing into one of these kinds of places, but we wouldn't place in this category yet because it's not stable and kind of hanging around for quite a while. And where we thought there was a gap in the literature is that usually unrecognized statehood is kind of explained as some kind of a mistake, right? That somebody screwed up, right? Obviously, unrecognized statehood is just normatively a terrible outcome for pretty much everybody involved. Right? You might think of a few of the separatist leaders who are kind of getting something that works out pretty well for them, but for the vast majority of everybody involved, this is really bad. Right? So someone had to have screwed up, right? And we think that that's actually not necessarily the case, and with a formal model that we can show that pretty convincingly. So what we're going to do is that we're going to use a game theoretic model. It's not, so technically, you can think of it as a repeated game. It's technically going to be a dynamic game because we're going to have some state variables here. And that we can show that under a certain set of conditions that unrecognized statehood will be the status quo, will be the equilibrium. It's technically, I wanted to simplify this. You can think of it as a subgame perfect Nash equilibrium. Technically, it's Markov perfect Nash equilibrium. We're going to model this with 4 players that we think are important. Right? Of course, there's going to be the home government of the territory that's in question and the secessionists, but there's also going to be a couple of outside actors. In almost all of these cases, we see that there's some kind of other state actor or something close to a state actor that is acting as the patron for the secessionists, right? Often Russia. And then there's also the international community that is almost always involved in some way, or we think ought to be involved and is not involved, but is a player, right? So it's going to be a 4-player game. There's actually a bunch of state variables, but the ones that's really important are going to be the payoffs to the secessionists of remaining in the status quo of unrecognized statehood. And we think of those as deteriorating over time. The longer you stay in this, the more isolated you are, kind of life gets worse and worse and worse from this isolation, right? And the basic idea is that you need the patron to be helping you out to maintain those payoffs, because eventually you're going to give in somehow because life just gets so bad. So the basic framework of this model, I'm not going to burden you with all of the details of it, is that in every kind of time period, however you want to define that, there's going to be a simultaneous game between the secessionists and the government, and they've got to each decide whether they're going to go with what's going on, they want to give in, or they want to reinitiate some kind of violent conflict to try to win this issue of status. What we're going to need for the status quo of unrecognized statehood to hold up as an equilibrium is that we're going to need both players to be like, okay, status quo, this is better than fighting or giving in. Now, of course, as I've already intimated, what we add to this is that being unrecognized is going to reduce the status quo payoffs for the secessionists as we go along. And we have this patron and the international community who can both make investments in all the various payoffs, right? They could invest in the military capabilities of one side or the other. They could make investments to make the status quo look better for one side or the other. Or they could make some inducements to try to get one side to give in. So I'll tell you about this model very quickly. I'll throw just a couple of pieces of notation up just to try to show you exactly the kinds of things that we're assuming, but you don't really need to learn any of that notation. I just want to be clear that you don't think I'm trying to pull any wool over your eyes. I'll tell you about the status quo equilibrium, but I think what's really important and what you should probably care about is that I think we can say important things about what the international community might want to do in these kinds of situations and the role that sanctions play, which is kind of the typical go-to policy intervention. So here's a picture. Each of the little blue dots is the beginning of a period, so that the timing that we think is probably most realistic is that the patron state decides whether it's going to make any investments in this game, whether it's going to basically change the incentives of either of the inside actors, the secessionists or the home government. Then the international community, which we call Player C for short, because international community doesn't fit on the slide very well, is going to kind of respond to that. And then there's going to be this game between, the typical game you would think of, between the secessionists and the home state. And then depending on what happens there, of course, the conflict could get resolved in some way, but if it doesn't, then we keep going and going, right? And it's at that point, at each new blue dot, that we're going to have a reduction in those status quo payoffs for the secessionists. Okay, so these outside guys, right? These guys who intervene externally, this international community we're going to model as desiring there to be reunification, wanting the secessionists to give in, following this norm of non-recognition, right? Nobody, in general, no state wants to encourage anybody else wants to give recognition because they don't want the chance that somebody in their home might get externally recognized, right? This is very strong international norm. Of course, the patron is on the side of the secessionists, and we're going to model this as the patron most preferring recognized independence. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. Of course, these guys are each aligned with one of the internal actors. That may not be the case for the patron, right? Looking at Ukraine, it's probably pretty clear that Russia doesn't really want any kind of resolution, depending on what you think there. But because we're trying to show the status quo as the equilibrium, assuming that the patron actually wants independence is going to stack the deck against us. It's going to make it hardest for us to establish this as equilibrium. So we're just making because we might think of the patron as either wanting independence or actually wanting to maintain the status quo and maintain this kind of disruption. We're making the assumption that's hardest for us to get the result that we want. Of course, all these results would hold up if you assume that the patron wanted to maintain the status quo. All right, thanks. These are a little ugly, and I'm not going to use these again except for this beta parameter. But all this is meant to say is just characterizing what I've set up here, right? That the patron is worse off if, I have this right, I think. If the secessionists rejoin, they're better off if they get recognition and vice versa. But it's going to be important how much the international community actually cares about getting kind of normalized, resolving this conflict in the way that they want, which is this reunification outcome. So, the obvious preferences for the inside actors, but of course, the real issue here, the reason that we have these intractable conflicts, is that this central issue of who controls this territory is indivisible, and both sides want it really bad, right? And typically, there aren't enough credible side payments to settle this easily, and this is why we've gotten stuck here, right? That's the crux of the issue. So here's a lot of notation. I don't want you to get caught up in any of it, but just in case people wanted to care, these are the kinds of things that we're making assumptions on. What are the payoffs for each side if you win, right? If you get recognition or you get reunification, what's the payoff in the status quo, and what's the payoff if you go to war there? We're going to have a typical war lottery, so we'll have a probabilistic outcome there and a little fixed cost of war. And of course, we have this with the status quo, right? You're going to have this fixed cost that you lose every period going through, right? But that's all the math. I just want, not that you need to track this through, I'm going to do everything else in terms of words, but I just wanted to show you the kinds of assumptions that we need to make to model this. And we can also, the whole thing goes through with a non-decisive war, but we had referees that made us take that out. But this can handle a lot more detail if we need it to. So the central thing that we were trying to show here, right, was that we do have an equilibrium where unrecognized statehood would be the outcome, right? And what that would look like is that you need to ensure that the unrecognized, or that the patron can kind of deter the international community from making a big enough investment to push the secessionists into kind of ceding the issue, right? So the patron has to be kind of willing to build up a big enough buffer in those payoffs to the secessionists from status quo at the beginning of the game. Then the patron has to be willing to kind of offset the degradation in the status quo payoffs as you go along every period. This version that I'm showing you is a deterministic game. If you put in a little bit of uncertainty, you would actually get the international community investing, but here there's going to be indifference conditions, so the international community actually doesn't do anything. And of course, both the players choose a status quo. So here's the interesting part, right? These are the conditions that we need to establish a status quo. So it's this dynamic game. So at the beginning, we need to start off with both of the players preferring the status quo, but this is our jumping off point, right? There's been some kind of a conflict. You got into this kind of unrecognized state thing, and now we're going to get stuck there, right? So we're kind of assuming this to start off with. Then we need the patron to have the resources to be able to deter the international community, to build that buffer up. And then the patron to have the resources period by period to keep making the investment. And then these I think are the key. I think this is where the insight really is. In order to get stuck in this middle place, right, if we have these outside actors that each prefer one outcome over the other, we need it to be such that they're each value, so to make it concrete, the patron needs to see that reunification is a lot worse compared to how much the international community wants to achieve the reunification. And then we need the international community to want to avoid recognition a lot more than the patron really wants to achieve it, right? So they have to be kind of look at like what's their most preferred outcome for each of them, and that they don't want that as bad as the other guy wants to avoid their worst outcome. And that'll just kind of stick you in the middle, right? That's the real kind of conclusion here. Right, and what this really boils down to, the reason, I mean, in reality, I think the reason that this happens and what the theory points us to is that essentially the international community has the resources to overcome the patron in almost every case, right? We're talking hundreds of countries versus one usually, but they just don't want it bad enough. If they wanted it bad enough, they could go in and settle this, right?
So 4 and 5, correct, so is unification supposed to be more important for the patron and recognition?
So the key is the last word, to avoid.
Oh, I see, okay.
Yeah, yeah. You want to, yeah, you're willing to pay to make sure it doesn't happen.
Got it.
Yep, yeah. All right, no problem. So once we have that set up in that main intuition, we can think about what now we know why we get stuck, right? So what might we do to to get unstuck? And typically what the international community does is some form of sanctions, right? And in most of those cases, if we look at the case studies, usually it will turn out to be some kind of a reinstated violence by the home state. And then we have a lot of these cases of unrecognized statehood that do get resolved. But the large majority of them are through new violence on the part of the home government, right? So this is where we kind of focused our efforts. So assume that we're in this status quo equilibrium, right? And I'm going to do this in 2 stages. So I want to do the simplest case first. Now assume that we put on these sanctions, and all the sanctions do is they make the status quo outcome worse, right? That the amount that we're getting worse every period is now larger. Okay, so the next proposition, I'll show you what happens if you're also hurting the military capabilities. So you're also changing the outcome to going to war for the secessionists. But here, this is just the simpler one. So in order for that to work in the way that the international community wants it to work, to get reunification to happen peacefully, right, to get the secessionists to cede, you need 3 conditions to hold, right? So that's already kind of a lot of conditions. First, you need the patron to either not want to or not be able to pay more than it was before every period, right? Because if the patron's just going to counteract the sanctions, then you're just going to be stuck in that unrecognized state. Another thing that could happen is now that things are just shifting a little bit, the patron might say, okay, it's not worth investing to maintain the status quo, but maybe it is worth investing in the military capabilities of the secessionists, and maybe we'll get what I want through war. There's some calculation I have to do with the war lottery and all of that, but maybe I just want to start some fighting instead, right? And this one is... sorry, there's a little bit of game theoretic notation in here. But what the third one really means is that if I'm looking out through the whole future and adding up like what each of these outcomes is worth to me through a present value type calculation, what we're relying on to get the secessionists to cede is like the status quo is getting worse faster now, and the patron no longer wants to pay to top it up. Right? And I need it to be such that as that's happening, when it falls below ceding is the next best option, right? Even if the patron's not making any kind of investments, if I say, okay, the status quo is getting really bad, but my next best option is to fight, then I'm going to fight, right? So this relies on a whole bunch of parameters, all lining up to get what the international community really wants to happen. There's a bunch of other bad things that can happen that are going to make it lead to fighting, right? Now that was kind of a best case scenario for the sanctions. I pushed that to work kind of for the international community. What if the sanctions also are going to, as often they're meant to do, degrade the military capabilities of the secessionists, right? Again, probably I should have softened the language. This is what the proposition really says in the paper. The more the sanctions hurt the military capabilities of the secessionists, the more likely it is that we're going to get war, right? Not because the secessionists initiate it, like it's getting harder and harder for them to win a war, because the home state says, oh, these guys suck now, right? I'm getting in there, right? I have a much better chance of winning. It wasn't worth it before, but now I can take these guys out, right? That's not going to lead them to, it's not going to lead to peaceful resolution, right? That's not the point, right? So we think that this, I mean, it's not a simple model. I mean, we tried to make it as simple as we could. I'll admit to that. But we do think that it helps us to structure the way that we think about this problem and gives some new insight and lets us see how unrecognized statehood really is a stable equilibrium. This is not a mistake. Something that goes on for 20 years or more is probably not a mistake, right? For me, the worst moment, best moment probably for publication, the worst moment for like the world was getting through this and thinking we should probably think about what's going on in Ukraine, like a year and a half ago, and it was like, oh crap, right? This is exactly what we're setting up. I think it shows us pretty clearly why sanctions are so often counterproductive for avoiding both violence and, in a lot of cases, resolution. It just doesn't get us any closer. So that's what I got. Thanks for your attention.